Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome a new contributor to the program today. His name is Aaron Sobczak. And Aaron, since this is the first time for members of our audience to meet you, take a moment and give us a little bit of your background. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Fairly recent graduate from grad school. Right now I'm writing and working primarily in the foreign policy space. I'm a reporter with the Quincy Institute's Responsible Statecraft publication. I also contribute fairly regularly to the Mises Institute's Mises Wire. All
right, well, I'm looking at an article you've written for International Policy Digest, and this seems especially timely, Aaron. The U.S. needs to step back from Israel. Set the stage for us, because I know this is dominating the news right now, the news cycle. There's a lot going on in Israel. The U.S. seems to be very, very involved. Why do they need to step back?
Well, so as I outlined in the article, from my perspective, is we're struggling to pay off just the interest on our national debt. We're becoming increasingly involved in all of these foreign conflicts, and especially as it seems as though the Biden administration is having trouble reining in or convincing Netanyahu to perform according to America's interests. I think it's about time that we really take a serious look at what we're doing there. What, is this really benefiting both parties equally? Us being as involved as we are.
And it's very curious. It seems like anytime someone questions, hey, is this really in our best interest? It's like time to cue up the accusations of, well, now, Aaron, are you coming at this from an anti-Semitic angle? Or it sounds to me like there's something much more practical at work in your thinking here.
Right. I mean, there's no question that, Israel, as I said in the article, that Israel, as with any country, has a right to defend itself, from outside threats. I would say that the United States and Israel, and not uniquely maybe, but certainly the United States and Israel have a tendency to maybe be surprised when predictable blowback occurs, when they participate in, let's say, actions that would aggravate their neighbors or aggravate other members of the world. So this isn't to say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist or that people don't have a right to form a country and feel safe in that country. This is just saying that as the situation becomes more and more complicated, as we get more entangled in it, it seems as though it's not in the United States' best interest to be Israel's primary benefactor.
I have to give you high marks for using the term blowback, which I feel like it's woefully underused in terms of describing a lot of the foreign policy realm these days. The U.S., I think, learned a lot about that on September 11th of 2001. Talk to me about some of the potential for blowback and some of the likely sources of that blowback with what is currently going on involving Israel in the Middle East.
Well, frankly, another potential instance could be another 9/11 or similar incident. In Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people and continued letters that he sent after 9/11, he outlined some of the reasons for why he encouraged jihad or why he encouraged reactions that he was and the terrorist actions. And outlined in those were primarily American presence in Saudi Arabia, American support of Israel and Lebanon and American troops in Lebanon, as well as American overall support of he called the Zionist State of Israel. So this isn't to say that America doesn't have a right to take actions or make allies where we think we should or where we think we should, but the reality of the world is, as someone who's an international realist, the reality of the world is that our actions have consequences and we should be prepared for them. And it would be really devastating if, while we're enabling Israel's actions in Gaza or Lebanon, some of that violence comes home in the form of another terrorist attack.
It seems like there are some rather predictable faces that always seem to be urging either more action on the part of the U.S. to support Israel militarily, or, for that matter, more action by Israel as well. Now, tell me, are you familiar with the Project for a New American Century?
I'm not sure if I am.
Okay, and I'll just give this very brief sidetrack, and then we'll come right back to your article here. Prior to
Okay.
the second invasion of Iraq, there was a group, the PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which had agitated for military action to remove Saddam Hussein from power. And they tried to sell it to Bill Clinton back in 1998. He wasn't buying. I think he did a couple of cruise missile strikes, into Iraq for misbehavior on Saddam's part. But it wasn't until after 9/11 that they had the emotional leverage to really commit to a full-scale invasion. And I only point this out because it was a small group of people, both Democrat and Republican, some elected, many unelected, who were pushing for this. And it always seems to be that same kind of cadre of people that are believing, we can just remake the world better through military force.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, it seems like that plays very well into a situation where I think Israel faces some very credible threats, but I think sometimes the threats that they face are enlarged by their response rather than simply them minding their own business, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree with both points you mentioned there. If you look at the Donald Rumsfelds, the Dick Cheneys of the world, even like the Lindsey Grahams, his very memeable spot on Fox recently when the hurricane, I believe Helene came through, and he
Good example.
said, "Yeah, this is bad, but we need to look at Israel." And that just blows my mind how out of touch some of these policymakers are. Polls show over and over again that the American people do not want to send troops to fight Israel's war, or for that matter, Ukraine's war. And we just sent our first group, about 100 troops, to help man a THAAD missile defense system in Israel, I believe 1 or 2 weeks ago. So the fact that the American public seems maybe a little more skeptical of these wars, maybe not as skeptical as they should be, but certainly more skeptical than some of the war hawks are. But it keeps happening. It's very frustrating. That's what I'm trying to point out here.
No, you do a wonderful job in this article. I know some people, anything short of, full-throated, yes, go Israel is going to seem as though it's somehow not towing the line. But I think you take a very good realistic approach to what is actually happening in the Middle East and why it's happening. And, one of the questions you raise is, the U.S. has been there for Israel for quite some time, and they've been very good to supply funding and military equipment. Has Israel ever reciprocated, when the U.S. needed a helping hand?
Yeah, and we see, for the most part, no. Israel and the U.S. have a very close intelligence sharing agreement. I find that to be mostly one-sided, though, because I think there's very few threats that might actually hurt America that Israel might detect, while there's a lot of things that we help Israel detect and defend against. We have no formal security or defense pacts with Israel. We supply, billions and billions in weapons and defense packages for them every year, but no formal defense treaty. Israel has not sent troops to assist the United States in any of our missions or any of our conflicts in the Middle East. And as I highlighted in the article, Israel has kind of a history of really pushing the boundaries as to how much the United States has to support Israel. We look like the USS Liberty or the Sinai crisis, or even now with how much Benjamin Netanyahu is seemingly ignoring Blinken and Biden's warnings about how far he should go into Gaza.
Yep. I think you do a marvelous job of summing up the challenge ahead of us. For people who want to follow your work, Aaron, what's the best way to go about that? Where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter or X at Aaron_Sobczak, Sobczak. You can also Google my name and you'll find me at Responsible Statecraft and the Mises Wire. That's where a majority of my work's going to be.
Yeah, by the way, strong praise for the Mises Wire. That is one of my go-to publications if I want to get a straight take on things. Again, we're talking with Aaron Sobczak. Aaron, thanks for tackling this, and it can be a touchy subject, but I think you did it wonderfully, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
Welcome back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Oscar Gill-Lewis back to the program. Oscar, we've had you on before, but for the sake of those meeting you for the first time, take just a moment to tell us about yourself.
Hi, Brian. It's a pleasure to be back on the show today. My name is Oscar Gill-Lewis. I'm a Young Voices contributor, and I'm also an editor for Speak Freely magazine.
Excellent. Well, today it looks like we're going to be talking about Keir Starmer. He is the Prime Minister of Britain, correct?
Correct, yes.
And the title here says his heavy hands could pose a serious threat to democracy. I'll admit I am not as well versed on what Keir Starmer has been up to lately, but where is he getting heavy-handed?
So what this article is about is essentially a critique of Keir Starmer's and the Labour Party, which he's the leader of, their plan to increase and empower the online safety bill in the United Kingdom. So what they want to do is it's basically increasing censorship of social media, and it's something that I believe is something very heavy-handed into the social media regulation.
What is the feel throughout the general populace? Do they want greater intervention on the part of for lack of a better phrase, policing free speech to make sure people aren't, putting incendiary speech out there? Or are they opposed to it? Are they indifferent?
So in terms of the general public, I would say that they're either indifferent or are not asking for greater free speech regulations or censorship or policing. Essentially, where this came from is in the summer in the UK, there were race riots because online there was some misinformation about the killer of a man who stabbed 3 girls, and they claimed that he was a Muslim immigrant, and the police put out certain information about him that they said that he wasn't, but they didn't publish all his information because of protected characteristics and other rules that guard how you can describe people and what information you can give out. And essentially Labour's idea is to crack down on social media and on misinformation and things like that can happen, legal but harmful speech that could lead to more things like this, more race riots or more hatred online.
I guess the concern that comes to mind immediately is who gets to decide what is potentially dangerous or what is potentially disinformation or misinformation. It sounds like that could become pretty self-serving legislation depending on who is doing the interpreting.
Exactly, and that's why this intervention is so heavy-handed. So basically, the Labour Party give Ofcom, which is the Office of Communications, it's the regulator for communications and general speech on TV, radio, social media in the UK. And what this bill will do is it increases definitions of what is hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and it gives Ofcom a greater ability to sanction social media companies, but not only social media companies, also user-to-user platforms. So this would include platforms like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal. So if you and I are texting, Brian, the Labour Party want to know what we're texting, and if we're texting misinformation to each other that could cause a race riot potentially. And this basically, in order to do this, you have to violate hundreds of thousands of users' privacy, and especially users' privacy who aren't in the UK, who still use those platforms. Wow.
I mean, the prospect of stopping something before it can happen, it just opens up so many potentialities for abuse. And I mean, I'm just trying to think of an instance where, it sounds like even if a person were to text a joke that was insensitive, they could potentially find themselves in real hot water, for doing so.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously the justification for this bill and for its increased power is not just we need to stop something bad happening like a race riot. It's also they claim to protect children. So they don't want children to see harmful content online. They want age restrictions and things like that. So in terms of the justification for it, they do have somewhat strong justification, but I think it's a Mott and Bailey argument where they use it to protect themselves, where they say, we want to make the UK the safest place online, and we're going to get rid of user privacy. But then they retreat back to, we need to protect the children, or we're just here to protect the children.
That does have a familiar ring, and it's a proven tactic. People will go along with some pretty they'll go along with some fairly heavy-handed stuff just for the sake of, but the children, we're thinking about
exactly.
them. So who is pushing back against this? I'm curious, who are the voices of dissent against what Keir Starmer is recommending?
So in the UK, I like to count myself as one of the people who are pushing back against this bill.
Attaboy.
In terms of organisations, there's the Free Speech Union, led by Toby Young, and also Silky Carlo, who heads the Big Brother Watch in the UK. And they're two people and two organisations that heavily push back against this bill and other encroachments on free speech in the UK.
Yeah, I can appreciate that there's probably some good intent somewhere in there, but it just seems like this would be such a great way to keep everyone off balance, unsure of what they can safely say or can't. So essentially, I think you point this out in your article, people will self-censor rather than risk finding themselves in a place where, I may have put something out there that could be deemed harmful. Yes,
exactly. So there are two problems with it. So that not only will you and I self-censor when we're on these platforms, but also the social media platforms will also more willingly delete or censor our speech and our content in order to avoid the heavy sanctions. So in my article, I sort of lay out that the sanctions can be up to either £18 million or 10% of their global revenue. Which is quite a huge amount. And in some cases, senior managers could also face jail sentences if they don't sanction speech that goes against what it says in the online safety bill.
Okay, that does sound pretty heavy-handed. There's no doubt about it. Is the prospect very good? Will Parliament go along with this? I mean, is it a fait accompli, or will there be some? Will they have to overcome some serious objections?
So my biggest issue with the bill is that the bill is already passed. But what Starmer is trying to do is he's trying to strengthen this bill. And so part of the bill is already in law, but the main meat of the bill will come into law in about 2025, 2026. And so it's already a bad bill. But he's trying to strengthen it before 2025 when the full bill comes into law. And I think there's a high probability that he'll have success with his majority in Parliament.
It just sounds like it would make it very difficult to talk about substantive issues if you have to look over your shoulder every few moments to make sure that you're not in a bad place.
Yes, I mean, it gets even worse than that, Brian. So if they pass this bill, it gives the Secretary of State even more power to censor speech online with less supervision from Parliament, because it would be through secondary legislation, which doesn't get as much parliamentary overview or challenge.
Yeah.
And so it would give the Secretary of State even greater opportunity to influence Ofcom, a supposedly independent organisation.
Wow. That is a significant challenge that you're facing. For people who want to learn more about this issue, or for that matter, if they wish to follow your writing, what's the best place for them to follow you or find you on social media?
You can find me on two places. You can find me on LinkedIn, Oscar Gill-Lewis, Gill-Lewis. And you can also find me on wespeakfreely.org.
Very good. Again, we're talking with Oscar Gill-Lewis, a Young Voices contributor. Oscar, thank you so much. Looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome Hudson Crozier back to the program. Hudson, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So for people meeting you for the very first time, let's take just a moment to delve into your background a little bit. Tell us who you are and what you do.
Right. So I'm Hudson Crozier. I study journalism at the University of North Texas, and I'm currently working in journalism part-time. I'm an editor for Upward News and a contributor to Young Voices. And lately I've been writing a lot of stuff related to the Israel-Hamas war, which is part of what we'll be talking about today.
Boy, that has been a very top-of-mind subject for a lot of people. And your article is asking the question, how much humanitarian aid is Hamas stealing? And you say Americans paying for it deserve to know. Set the stage for us, if you will. Does a lot of this humanitarian aid come following Israel's crackdown on the Gaza area following last year's October 7th attack?
Right. So the basic rundown of the situation is that the war that started last October 7th, yes, because of the Hamas attack, the war has been very rough for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. There's been lots of civilian deaths and injuries and people losing their homes and starvation and things of that nature. And so naturally, the U.S. has been, for the past several months, sending hundreds of millions of dollars worth of shipments of humanitarian aid to those regions to hopefully help some of the desperate people. But there appears to be mounting evidence that the Hamas terrorists who dominate the Gaza Strip are taking at least some of it for their own selfish ends. And the Biden-Harris administration doesn't really have any effective way of assuring that they don't do that because we don't have people on the ground there. We have to just trust. We outsource the work to these NGO humanitarian workers and UN workers and things like that, but they're totally defenseless against the crazy armed terrorists who run the place.
Okay, so I guess I have to ask the question that looms large in my mind. I'm sure others are thinking this too. Better to send the U.S. military to deliver that aid, or does that just exacerbate the situation?
That would be hard to justify politically, I think, even just from a neutral standpoint. I think most people probably don't want U.S. troops on the ground very much related to the Israel war. Now, I know that the administration has sent a few troops just to help Israel set up a missile defense system recently. I'm not sure if that would extend to actually putting army soldiers on the ground to go to Gaza and potentially confront Hamas to make sure this humanitarian aid gets where it needs to go. That could be a pretty big escalation. But on the other hand, if you don't do that, you pretty much leave these shipments vulnerable to being hijacked as they continue to be, because they're, just to give some of the evidence, we have videos going around reported in media outlets around the region showing these armed, masked men on top of the aid trucks that come in, and it's just a very wild, messy situation over there.
It's very reminiscent of about 30 years ago in Somalia, when the U.S. was part of a humanitarian peacekeeping mission there, and as aid would be delivered to starving Somalians, here would come the warlords with, their soldiers to commandeer the shipments and take them for their own ends and purposes. And so I'm having a little deja vu here with what Hamas is accused of doing with these shipments. And as far as the American taxpayer paying for this is, let me just come right out and ask you, is this a proper use of taxpayer funds? Should U.S. citizens be expected to fund this? Is this something that would be better handled through private organizations?
Well, it sort of is handled through quasi-private organizations, considering that that's who we trust to try to deliver the aid on the ground. But regardless of whether you think we should be spending the money on this, it's just simple that if you have to ensure that there are actual safeguards to make sure that these supplies go where they are supposed to go, instead of the U.S. effectively funding its own enemies, because that's who is actually getting some of it. And unfortunately, this goes way beyond the current Gaza conflict or the Middle East itself. It speaks to a broader policy problem for the U.S. government. If you look, not to get too off topic, but if you look at Ukraine right now, for months, there have been some reports from inside the government, different auditing agencies within the government that have been saying we effectively cannot perform the proper monitoring of the military supplies that we're sending over to Ukraine. And that has resulted in, on a few occasions, criminals and arms traffickers, including some criminals controlled by Russia, which Ukraine is fighting, to get a hold of some of these weapons, even on the front lines. And just a few weeks ago, we had another one of those reports from the Government Accountability Office, once again saying that the Pentagon is not performing what the law calls end-use monitoring, which is required by law, but they're unable to perform that.
Well, and on a related note, the withdrawal from Afghanistan a few years ago, that was a lot of taxpayer-funded military hardware that was left behind for the Taliban to reclaim and repurpose or sell as it deemed, what it wanted to do with it. But it seems like sometimes there's a cavalier attitude on the part of the U.S. government, like, the taxpayers, they can afford more. As a taxpayer, sometimes I feel like, hey, maybe you should ask me first before you start throwing my money around like that.
Right. And what's so sadly hilarious about this whole thing is that we pretty much have a few admissions from the Biden-Harris administration that it is entirely possible for Hamas to take this stuff. When Biden announced the first shipment last October, he pretty much said he gave this stern warning to Hamas not to steal any of the stuff or else the shipments might cease. Now, you don't warn a group not to do something unless you are basically implying that you cannot actually stop them, or no warning would be required. And then later on, there was a U.S. envoy, I don't remember his name at the moment, but he was saying, Israel hasn't provided us any specific examples of Hamas stealing aid. And then later on in his talk, he admits, well, yes, Hamas does pretty much decide where and to whom the assistance goes within the region. It's just kind of like, again, you have to think of Hamas as the government of Gaza, because sadly that is the case. They decide what happens. So,
wow. Well, I mean, look, on the one hand, I believe that there is suffering and there are people who really deserve humanitarian supplies. But this is kind of shaking my faith, not just in our government, but I think in most governments to accurately and to faithfully deliver those goods as promised, or outsource, their delivery to non-governmental organizations. So I have to ask you this. Is there a better way, or are there other ways that are not being explored by which that aid could be reaching the people who need it the most?
I'm not sure if I'm really the foreign policy expert to say how we could make it happen, but it looks like a heck of a conundrum that we have, because as we've been saying before, certainly a more efficient way to make sure that the supplies go where they're supposed to go is to have U.S. officials on the ground. But then you have this problem of the fact that no one really wants that. We don't want more intervention, more involvement in the Middle East, more chances of U.S. troops. I mean, we just had U.S. troops recently get killed by the Houthi fighters in Yemen. We don't want any more of that. So then what do you actually do? It's a really tough question. I don't claim to have the answer, but I just know from what I've written and what I've researched that the answer is certainly not to just sign off on millions of dollars worth of shipments that we pay for with our taxes and just kind of throw them over there to these really messy, corrupt regions of the world and just hope that it goes well. And we sort of act like Biden just acts like it's the thought that counts. It's just, look at how generous the United States is. But you actually have to reckon with the practical considerations that come with that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your conclusion too, which is, hey, look, we're solving everybody's problems. That's kind of how our government portrays itself, but it's actually signaling something that's not nearly as complimentary. There's incompetence, there's apathy, there's lack of transparency. I know you mentioned in the article you've tried to get records, to see where that's going, and it sounds like you've kind of been stonewalled.
Right. So I did FOIA requests to the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department, which are the two agencies in charge of these kinds of humanitarian shipments all over the world. And this is not unique to this issue. The FOIA process for anybody is just such a pain in the butt. Like, they don't respond to records requests quickly. But some transparency would be definitely warranted here. Again, we're talking with Hudson Crozier. He is a Young Voices contributor. Where can you be found on social media? You can look up my name, Hudson Crozier. That's Crozier on Twitter/X, or read more of my work for Young Voices.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Alex Xenos back to the program. He's our final guest for today's fourth and final segment. Alex, good to have you back on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for having me.
You bet. Now, of course, the fact that you're on here means you are a Young Voices contributor. For the sake of people meeting you for the first time, take just a moment to give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a lawyer, but I'm definitely not your typical lawyer. So I serve as counsel for a nonprofit. I really see my career as dedicated to both public service and the cause of liberty. So a lot of my work falls outside of what you would see from a traditional lawyer at a traditional law firm. And I see my writing, especially with with Young Voices, as part of that.
Well, I'm looking at an article you wrote for DC Journal, Why I Oppose Using History and Tradition as a Test. And when we talk about a test, what kind of test are we talking about? Court cases?
Yeah. So as the court has become more originalist, it and scholars have grappled how to conduct originalist analysis properly. And we have seen that struggle play out since 2022 in numerous decisions. And one of the major drivers of this debate is that for years, many lower courts have done their best to get around the Supreme Court's more originalist jurisprudence. And then so what we have seen emerging out of these cases is sort of a test based on history and tradition. So the court often relies on this test when the government restricts conduct that falls within the text of certain core constitutional rights, such as the Second Amendment, or when the court evaluates the existence of a right that's not even found in the text of the Constitution. So the test's application differs depending on the context, and there is a lot of disagreement in describing it. But at its core, it mandates consistency with history and tradition through the identification of a historical analog. And so if you don't have an analog practice or statute, the test is going to fail. And so that means, for example, in the Second Amendment context, if a state passes a gun control measure that impedes on the right to bear arms, there must have been some sort of analogous restriction in history for courts to uphold that gun control measure. So as I've said, there are disagreements about the scope, but this is a good approximation. And then since 2022, the court has used this history and tradition test to decide several landmark cases, including Bruin, Dobbs, and Kennedy. And now we're seeing those disagreements about the scope of the test break out in the past term in published opinions. Specifically, Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote several concurrences basically saying that the scope of the test was being drawn too narrowly, meaning the specificity of the analogy required was too great, meaning, she believes you don't need to find a statute that is super close to the one being challenged. And now what I'm arguing is that history tradition can't really be a test at all. It really cannot definitively determine the parameters of rights. Rather, they can only provide evidence as to what those parameters are. So I think it is a mistake to use it as a test, but it's absolutely a useful evidentiary tool.
Interesting.
And I would say, the practical reasoning behind the test is understandable, right? So somehow judges are got to be reined in to follow the original public meaning of the Constitution one way or another, and a test might be the most effective way to do it. But you cannot betray public meaning originalism to save public meaning originalism. Modern originalism interprets the Constitution based on the public meaning of the text at the time of adoption. So the law of the Constitution is not going to be found in the history tradition, or even the words or the actions of the framers. The words they wrote down are what matter. Just because there is a history tradition of something doesn't make it constitutional. Conversely, just because there is not a history or tradition of a certain practice does not make a law or government action unconstitutional. Of course, history and tradition can shed light on the meaning of constitutional provisions, but that is far different from allowing history and tradition to actually dictate the meaning. And they're just, go ahead.
One thing I wanted to come back to on this, because, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding, but when we talk about something being constitutional, I know that there's a school of thought that's like, well, our rights are determined by the Constitution, or it explains the extent of our rights. My understanding is what the Constitution does is, number one, calls the government, the federal government, into existence, and then describes the form, the function, and the upper limits of its power. Meaning, if we look to the Constitution for what you and I should be allowed to do, that's not a good way to go. If we look to it to describe what government, the extent to which government may operate, that's a much better way to look at it. Would you agree? Would you disagree?
Yeah, I would agree. So the Constitution is going to lay out the form, the structure of government, separation of powers, What it's not meant to do is exactly what you said. It's not meant to delineate everything the government can do and everything the government can't do. There was this huge debate about when they were introducing the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, about just this, about not needing it versus needing it, and then that's why you get the 9th and 10th amendments.
Okay. No, I appreciate it. And I love the fact that you used, for instance, the right to keep and bear arms as one of those tests where, okay, but traditionally, how do we look at what has happened before? How do we have a clear understanding of what was intended, under original intent? And it seems like sometimes, this is just from my subjective point of view, it seems like there are some justices that are immensely creative. And I don't mean that in a necessarily complimentary way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then I think this is what this debate kind of comes about. When you start talking about analogies and tying whether something is constitutional or not directly to an analogy, you allow for a lot of selective nitpicking, and that's when you see a lot of creativity. And the relevance of history and tradition to the original meaning decreases the farther away you get from ratification. So you get these faulty precedents and unconstitutional statutes that build upon each other. So once courts and legislatures deviate from following that original public meaning, the history and tradition of those practices and laws become irrelevant. They don't tell us much of anything. And so that's why you're going to see like a lot of this creativity of like picking and choosing. It just doesn't necessarily make sense when you start digging under the surface. I'm sorry, but the case of, what is it? Is it Filburn v. Wickham?
Wicker v. Filburn. It was a terrible case.
That to me is a great example of a case that has just a bad case that was built upon, and now it's like Congress is so inextricably involved in anything that could be considered interstate commerce that it seems like we hardly have room to breathe.
And basically everything is now considered interstate commerce except for extremely, isolated incidents.
Talk to me about the Sedition Act, because you bring this up toward the end of your article. To me, this is one of the first really solid examples of the federal government slipping off its leash, so to speak, when Congress passed that act in 1798. What were the lessons that they could have and should have learned from the Sedition Act?
Yeah, so I think this ties directly into what I was saying earlier about how just because Congress legislature acts doesn't necessarily mean it's constitutional. So really what should be taken away from that is exactly that. So you can't really have any confidence in a precedent based on legislators acting. And so that's kind of the lesson that the court should take away from that is, look, hey, we had this example. It was not struck down by the courts. And so you should never assume the constitutionality of a given statute or practice. And so my concluding message to originalists is, and borrowing language from Judge Kevin Newsom of 11th Circuit, which I think I do quote in my piece, traditionalism gives off originalist vibes, but it's not actually an originalist method. The temptation is understandable. I mean, it's very effective at reining in judges, but a modern originalism stands to the proposition that means do not justify ends. We can use history and tradition as evidentiary tools to help determine that original public meaning, but let's not use it as a test.
Alex, we're down to about 30 seconds here, but I have to ask you, for people who don't have a law degree but nonetheless would like to have a better understanding of this and issues similar to this, are there any resources you could recommend?
Yeah, I think, The Vault Conspiracy at Reason's a very good source. It is a bit more on the scholarly side. I think people like Dan McGoffin at National Review are great at explaining these cases. Charles C.W. Cook is probably the best non-lawyer I can recommend at National Review at explaining this stuff in simple terms.
Okay,
but yeah, it
I would
definitely
second Charles C.W. Cook, marvelous writer. Again, we're talking with Alex Xenos. He is an attorney and Young Voices contributor. Alex, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter or X at AMXENOS. That's AM Xenos. And I also have a Substack that's called The Xenos Report.